Narrative for Unit 4, Lesson 2. Obeying authority is part of self-control. Activity number 1.
Freddie goes camping. Freddie was 9 years old when his father died. Since his father's death, Freddie's lack of self-control was beginning to concern his mother and grandfather. He would not listen to his mother. His grandfather hoped that spending time with him would make a difference, so he planned a fishing trip with Freddie. Both Freddie and his grandfather had their own tents. Usually, they worked together to put up the tents, but this time Freddie decided to put his up alone.
Okay, let me know if you need any help.
His grandfather chuckled. Freddie noticed that his grandfather had put his tent up rather quickly. He had set his cot up and finished putting things away in the tent. When Freddie's grandfather was finished, he noticed Freddie was still struggling with his tent and offered to help.
No, that's okay.
Freddie huffed as he still struggled with the ropes.
I want to do it myself.
Okay, Freddie.
His grandfather said.
I'm going to unload the food and finish setting up camp.
By the time grandfather had finished, Freddie was finished also. Well, sort of finished. The tent was slightly lopsided and the guide ropes weren't quite tight enough. But grandfather didn't say anything.
Let's eat!
Grandfather announced.
Freddie, would you please get the wood for the fire?
Sure, Grandfather.
Freddie smiled.
In fact, I'll build a fire.
No, Freddie. That could be dangerous. You can set up the wood, but I want you to wait for me to start the fire.
Freddie gathered the twigs and wood. Then he set up the wood as Grandfather had taught him in the past. Grandfather had gone to the lake to get some water.
I'll surprise Grandfather and start the fire,
Freddie thought. Freddie went into Grandfather's tent and got the matches. Freddie lit the first match, but he couldn't get the fire going. Then he lit another one, and then another.
Ouch!
Freddie shouted as he burned his fingers.
What's wrong?
Grandfather shouted as he got to the top of the hill.
Nothing,
Freddie answered. Freddie watched as his grandfather lit the fire. Grandfather noticed the used matches on the ground, but chose not to say anything at that time. They had a great evening together. When it was time for bed, Grandfather noticed some clouds rolling in. He asked Freddie if he wanted him to check his tent before he went to sleep.
I'll be fine.
Freddie smiled.
I'm getting to be an expert at this camping stuff. Sleep tight, Grandfather.
During the night, a storm blew in. There were strong winds and heavy rains, which caused Freddie's tent to cave in on him. Dripping wet, Freddie burst through the door of his grandfather's tent.
What's the matter?
Grandfather asked.
My tent collapsed.
Replied Freddie solemnly.
May I have some dry clothes?
Here, they may be big, but at least they are dry. I hope you have learned a lesson.
Grandfather said.
Maybe next time you will allow me to check your tent, to be sure everything is okay.
Freddie didn't reply, but he thought to himself.
It wasn't my fault.
The following day was very busy for Freddie. He had to set up his tent again. This time he allowed his grandfather to double-check his work. Then he had to hang all his clothes and sleeping bag out to dry. Grandfather built a strong fire and instructed Freddie to put his sneakers a safe distance from the fire to dry. Grandfather had warned him not to put them any closer or they would melt. After some time, Freddie became impatient. His sneakers weren't drying fast enough.
I'm going to place them a little closer to the fire. Maybe they will dry faster,
Freddie thought. Freddie placed his sneakers on the rocks by the fire and continued hanging up his clothes. Shortly after, there was a funny smell.
Oh, no!
Cried Freddie.
Freddie,
Grandfather exclaimed.
what have you done?
The rubber on Freddie's sneakers was melting. What a mess! Grandfather pulled them away just in time. They were still wearable, at least for the rest of the camping trip.
Freddie,
Grandfather said sternly.
I need you to obey me. When I give you instructions, it is for your benefit. When you choose to disobey, you create problems for you and me. You need to practice self-control and show respect to me by obeying my instructions.
Later that afternoon, Freddie decided to go for a walk.
May I please go for a walk, Grandfather?
Freddie asked.
Sure,
Grandfather replied.
but remember what we talked about this morning. Stay where I can see you. Don't go too close to the lake, and shout to me at any sign of danger. There's a nice berry patch not far from here. Why don't you take this can with you and pick some berries for after supper?
Freddie took the can from Grandfather. He decided to go for a walk, and on the way back, he would pick berries. He started off down the path and found himself near the lake. Freddie thought to himself,
I know how to swim. I'll be okay. Grandfather worries too much. I'm just fine. I'll just throw a few rocks and look for fish. Then I'll go back. No problem. What Grandfather doesn't know won't hurt him.
Freddie started skimming rocks across the water. Soon, Freddie became bored with that and began walking on the shoreline. There was an area of stepping stones in the water, so he began jumping from stone to stone. The rocks were a little more slippery than Freddie expected, and the grips on his sneakers had melted smooth. He lost his balance and fell into the lake. Freddie tore his pants on the rocks and got a nasty cut on his leg.
Boy, am I in trouble now. Grandfather's really going to be upset.
Freddie thought as he limped up the hill.
Did you go into the lake after I asked you not to, Freddie?
His grandfather asked very sternly.
You could have drowned. As it is, you are seriously hurt.
While Grandfather was treating his wound, Freddie said remorsefully,
Now I understand what you were saying about following instructions.
Freddie, do you realize that instructions are given to you to help you make the right choices?
Grandfather asked. Freddie nodded.
Do you also realize that every time you chose to disobey your instructions, you have been hurt or injured or have caused something to go wrong? Instructions are to help you make the right decisions and to help you to not make mistakes.
His grandfather continued.
No one can force you. You have the authority to make the right choice. Part of growing up is learning to make right choices, even if it may not be what you want at the time. This is what we call self-control, and only you have control over your actions. I also have a choice I can make. If you are going to continue to disobey me, then I will choose to return home, and this will be our last camping trip. I cannot risk you getting hurt any more than you already have, because you choose not to listen and obey.
Grandfather, I don't want to go home. Please, can we stay? I will follow your instructions from now on.
Freddie said sorrowfully. Grandfather took a deep breath and looked directly at Freddie.
Okay, Freddie, we'll give it another try.
Freddie agreed to follow all his grandfather's instructions. That day, he learned that he needed to follow instructions to keep himself and others safe.